In short, the politicians are not doing the job they're paid for. They're supposed to, make, the negotiations, and at the same time compromises on behalf of the people. And the people meaning the families of the victims of the, Sewol tragedy. But they're not doing their job properly.
That's Oh-Young Jin. He's the managing editor of the Korea Times, and his interview will be coming up later in the program. You're listening to Asia News Weekly, a digest of news from the Asia-Pacific region. Is there no hope for bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo? Is Singapore the key to soothing regional tensions? And why is South Korea transfixed on the Sewol tragedy? These stories and more are coming up on the September 5th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to the show, everyone. I'd like to thank you for spending part of your week by downloading this week's podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller. Kicking things off this week is a follow-up to one of the stories from last week's episode taking place in Japan. Now, I mentioned last week that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe wrote a letter to a shrine in Japan. Now, that shrine houses over 1,000 convicted war criminals. And in this letter, he said that the spirit of the Showa-era martyrs became the foundation of their fatherland by sacrificing their souls for the sake of peace and prosperity of today's Japan. And while that letter was dated back in April, it was just released and confirmed last week. Now, immediately, China and South Korea condemned his actions. In fact, South Korea said writing that letter was worse than going to the Yasukuni Shrine. Now, these words are very harsh, but essentially, they are also very true. Abe effectively, in this letter, on paper, whitewashes history. But we've all made mistakes in the past, and we can exist where we are today without those mistakes. We need to learn from them. And that's one of the things that China and South Korea consistently point out to Japan. It appears as if the nation is not learning from past mistakes. Now, since taking office, President Park Geun-hye in South Korea and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, they really haven't been playing nice with one another. In fact, they can't even meet face-to-face without U.S. President Obama sitting between them. And these are two United States allies and are key to the region. And I had to wonder, could this be the nail in the coffin that would cancel any hope of a meeting between these two heads of state? Returning to the podcast is regional policy expert Anthony Murphy. Anthony, welcome back to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me on again.
So just how bad is it?
The exact verbiage that Abe used was, for example, calling World War II war criminals the foundation of our country, or referring to them as martyrs. Now, this kind of thing has happened before with other prime ministers in Japan's history, not that long ago. And the reaction from China and South Korea has been very, very similar to what it's being reacted to now. It's similar to, for example, when North Korea decides that it's time for them to cause a row in the region by launching a missile. You know, if they launch a missile tomorrow, of course, the international community is going to have a reaction to it, but it's not the first time that they've done it, and probably not the last time they're going to do it. It's the same way with Japanese prime ministers pandering to the conservative base of their country, which is quite large. Shinzo Abe belongs to the Liberal Democratic Party. The LDP is what you'll hear it referred to as. And they're very, very conservative. Despite their name, they're not liberal. And I would argue that they're not democratic. So they're extremely conservative, a group of insiders who trade power amongst each other and have control over Japanese politics and have had control over Japanese politics for many decades now. So they're not liberal, they're not democratic in action, although their name says that they are. They pander to a very large conservative base of the country, and that's what you see happening here with Shinzo Abe.
Well, let's take that further. Recently, it was President Obama who physically had to sit down to get Abe and Park to even talk to one another.
Right.
Do you think that even that overture with President Obama basically forcing the two to meet could even happen after this?
I think that that's what Japan wants to have happen. South Korea and China are both very, very important for Japanese interests, just as they are for American interests. Same. So I think that Shinzo Abe definitely wants to have a summit, and what he was trying to avoid was having just this very same reaction from South Korea and China. Unfortunately, his efforts backfired greatly. What he was trying to do is, instead of physically visiting the shrine and paying homage and giving a speech, as most politicians before him have done, he sent this letter. And that's the crux of the whole situation. The letter, the verbiage that he's used in the letter has really angered South Korea and China because of the type of words that he's chosen to use. He was trying to avoid just this very outcry from them in preparation for a summit with them. And it doesn't look like that summit is going to happen anytime soon, partly because of this.
Bottom line, Anthony, could the discord affect U.S. interests between these two allies?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, Steve, I don't see a lot of long-term strategic interests at stake for the United States.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I do appreciate your time.
Anytime.
I'd like to thank Anthony Murphy for joining me this week. Now, you've heard the latest between Japan, between South Korea and China. Now, I want to hear from you. Could there be any hope to salvage diplomatic ties between South Korea and Japan, or is everything lost? Coming up later in the program, why South Korea is transfixed on the Sewol tragedy. When we talk about this region, the Asia-Pacific region, there's one particular area that truly concerns me, and that is the areas surrounding the East China Sea and the South China Sea, even more so than North Korea. And keep in mind, I live in Seoul. Since China unveiled the 9-dash line, there have been a number of confrontations, especially around the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands. Memory recalls a water cannon duel that took place earlier this year, and let's not forget that Japan is making efforts to station more troops in the area and position more radar outposts to keep a closer eye on China. We also should mention several near misses in the skies over the seas. In fact, last week I mentioned a near miss between a U.S. and Chinese patrol craft, where the Chinese craft buzzed the U.S. plane, coming within 20 feet of it. And that's just way, way too close. But by far, the most physical confrontations of late have been taking place between China and Vietnam. Earlier this year, China moved an oil rig into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, and with it brought 120 or so ships. The two nations collided, and China managed to sink several Vietnamese fishing boats and even collided with Vietnamese Coast Guard ships. The citizens in Vietnam were understandably upset, and they protested, and in some cases violently, burning Chinese factories and causing significant damage. China ultimately did pull some of its own citizens out, and when China did remove the oil rig, it was Vietnam who then apologized for the row, trying to save its economic relationship with the larger nation. It's this action that truly shows how much power China wields in the region, and the fact that China is dictating terms, and really, no one is stepping up to curtail its actions. I've said this repeatedly. There exists an imbalance of power, and China is simply too powerful in the region. It dictates terms to weaker countries, and the poorly organized ASEAN member states just simply aren't up to the task to reel in China. Furthermore, the United States and Japan really haven't stepped up, and they're playing diplomacy and trying to keep things safe and avoid conflict. The end result is that China has secured the area. Tensions do continue to rise, and unfortunately I do see on the horizon the potential for limited altercations. Some major power needs to step in and sort things out. Just who might that be?
In my opinion, I believe you should have a small, neutral power, and for that, I think Singapore holds the key.
That's Suhith Sitharthan, a strategic analyst who worked with the top think tanks in the Netherlands and Australia.
In my opinion, they are the risk bearer of last resort because they currently find themselves in a very unique position. They not only have cordial relations with their neighbors such as Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, to say the least, but they are also respected by China. And this might seem hard to believe considering their size and stature. But ever since Deng Xiaoping, the chief architect of modern China, sought Lee Kuan Yew's, which was the Singaporean former prime minister's advice on market reforms in the late 1970s. I believe it was in 1978. Ever since that time, these two countries have fostered, you could say, a special relationship. And it is based on that relationship that I feel that Singapore should use to secure its own future as well as the future stability of the region. And I do take into consideration the size, the stature, and the limitations of Singapore. Domestically, they have issues. But on a foreign policy scale, no issue is bigger than the current South China Sea conflagration, or the coming conflagration, as I would say. And if you take with over, like, for example, with China, for example, with over 4,000 years of history and tradition of studying war, diplomacy, and negotiations, the Chinese are not by any stretch of the imagination easy to deal with, especially when it comes to matters concerning the South China Sea, which by in itself is a misnomer, because in Vietnam it is known as the East Sea, to the Philippines it's known as the West Philippine Sea, and to the Chinese themselves they call it the South Sea. In fact, a more accurate term would be the Malay Sea, after the Malays of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, who until relatively recently were also the principal inhabitants of Taiwan and much of coastal Vietnam. In fact, China only occupies about a quarter of the sea's shoreline, which is otherwise shared by 500 million people of Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Brunei, and I believe Malaysia as well. But the importance here is that if you look at economically, the South China Sea is actually very important, not only to the Chinese, but they're also very important to Singapore as well. And by having Singapore mediate, it's like having to secure your own economic future. Because if you see the scale, like for instance, over 80% of Chinese oil imports flow through the Strait of Malacca and into the South China Sea. So, for instance, if the Chinese were to blockade that area in retaliation for, hypothetically, American encirclement, for instance, that blockade will have huge economic costs for countries in that region. And that includes Singapore as well. Now, why should Singapore get into this act so late in the game? Well, it's at this stage right now that the South China Sea is gaining traction, has a tipping point, a point where that you could either go badly wrong or you could go in a different direction, which is into conciliation or having mutual agreements or treaties or pacts. And I say this because when the current Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, reinterpreted Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, alarm bells start to ring. Because reinterpreting Article 9 basically means that, well, among other things, he could rearm, remilitarize, and get into areas where previously he wasn't able to get into. And he knew this. He knew that he could reinterpret the article instead of getting a 2/3 majority from the Diet, which he knew he wasn't able to get. Hence, reinterpreting this article would actually allow him to get involved in the dispute, hence trying to curtail China's ascension, or you could say dominance in the region. And apart from that, he's also trying to, for instance, remilitarize and supply countries such as Vietnam with new naval equipment to cope with the deterrence threat that China.
You're absolutely right, because they're also pledging support to the Philippines and giving vessels to the Philippines as well.
Exactly. And this is a major debate right now. And if you look at the Chinese, in contrast, right, they do not wish to go to war because they have studied the course of conventional warfare, naval warfare, and are instead seeking effective strategies to counter American encirclement and to reassert its regional dominance. And the best possible way to do this would be to find, in my opinion, a mutually agreeable solution through engaging with disputed parties.
But up until now, I mean, and you've said this in your article, China's been unwilling to discuss things on a multilateral scale. They prefer, one-on-one discussions with each of the nations that they have disputes with. I mean, is it likely that they would entertain dialogue via Singapore?
Well, you're absolutely correct in your assertion that they do this sort of negotiation, bilateral negotiations. But that is part of their strategy. It's not an unwillingness on their part. It is a negotiating strategy towards an end game. See, their strategy is pretty simple. I'm trying to simplify it, of course. But their strategy is isolating the country's representative and having a negotiation with them instead of multilateral talks would actually increase their bargaining power. And in my opinion, that can only work to a certain extent, after which you have to look at the cost associated with those talks. And I don't think anything effective have actually come out of those talks, to be quite honest, especially with Japan now in the game. And so I think China would think very hard about getting back into multi-party discussions. And the wise, I would say the strategic way would be to have Singapore mediate as a neutral entity. And I think that could be possible. And also, if you look at it, China's preoccupation with the South China Sea is not motivated by oil or the diminishing supply of fisheries in that area. It is primarily geared towards strategic positioning. And to that effect, they are closely monitoring the events in Ukraine. Now that may come out of the blue for some of your listeners, but it is an observable fact, I would say. What happens in Ukraine right now and the international response, China will study them, and China will analyze them, and they will seek to use them as part of their exit strategy, I would say. And that is quite possibly something we have to be aware of. And that is the reason why I think that Singapore's entry into this multi-party talks it's absolutely essential. In fact, critical, in my opinion.
Suhith Sitharthan, thank you very much for joining me this week.
Thank you very much, Steve.
All right. What do you think will be the solution to the conflict in the China Seas? Leave your thoughts in the comments or share them on social media. If you'd like to know more about this or any of the stories mentioned in the podcast, take a look at the show notes over at asiannewsweekly.net. April 16th is a day still fresh in the collective consciousness of most people here in South Korea. On that fateful morning, the Sewol ferry sank off the coast of Jindo and took with it over 300 souls, many of which were children. Now, since then, there have been countless protests. There have been many hunger strikes. And I decided to find why this particular issue is galvanizing South Korea. Joining me on the phone is Young-Jin Oh, the managing editor of the Korea Times. How are you doing today?
I think I'm doing less than okay, I think. I've been tired of.
So since the sinking of the Sewol in April, there has been a fairly steady outcry of public opposition to the way that the government has responded, to the way that the government is handling the situation. There are weekly protests, we've seen hunger strikes, there's even still a memorial in front of City Hall. And I want to ask you why. Why is this particular issue so important to the Korean public, and why has it galvanized so much public support 5 months after the sinking?
But number one, I think it's related to the number of the casualties, because 300 people died in this unfortunate incident, and plus, as you point out, many of them majority of them, the absolute majority of them are high school students on field trip to Jeju. Everybody can be one time or another the parents, right?
Right.
So it's not it's kind of the stain, big stain on our collective consciousness. it cannot be easily evaded. And as a matter of fact, I think we need to, let this, the tragedy, in a way, linger on, so that, we can, come up with some measures, to ensure that this kind of, unfortunate thing will never happen again.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, because this is, as you know, a very important thing for the nation. We have the memorials all over the country, including in front of City Hall. But passing the Sewol bill, the investigation bill, still is stumbling in Parliament. If this is such an important issue for the nation, why can't the bill be passed?
But number one, I think, it's, the devil is in details. And having said that, and I also wanted to point out the, lack of abilities by, on the part of the politicians. And politicians are not, in short, the politicians are not doing the job they're paid for. They're supposed to, make, the negotiations, and at the same time compromises on behalf of the, the people. And the people meaning the families of the victims of the, Sewol tragedy. But they're not doing the, their job properly. That's, the primary reason why this, the bill has been stuck as it is for days and for months.
Well, do you think that one particular party is causing more of a stumbling block in Parliament? Because we've seen both parties bring out allegations of graft against the opposition. Why can't they just discuss it and come to a consensus?
I don't think that's, that's when you look at the, first of all, main opposition party. I think, main opposition party is at the fort. Because they have a bad, on the Sewol, the tragedy, for their previous, 2 elections, they lost. They haven't had any other agenda to go on except for the Sewol. In other words, they put all the eggs in the same basket, and that's causing the problem. That's, causing the, the main opposition, to have no tools to negotiate with the, ruling, Senate party. But I'm not saying that, the Senate party is free from any blame. Because, as a governing party, it should have shown its leadership in this kind of, the tragedy. How to deal, resolve this kind of tragedy through the parliamentary measures. And they are, falling far short of expectations and falling far short of assigned missions as a ruling party. So I blame both parties, and I blame, the president, the Park Geun-hye as well. Because we have the parliamentary system that's, coupled with the presidential system, right? And when the parliament is, in stalemate, it is the president who should, act and, show the leadership so that, get the, things moving in this country. But she has failed to do so. And I also, in that sense, on that account, I blame, President Park as well.
Now let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about the crew. They're currently on trial for various crimes, including dereliction of duty and negligent homicide. And the captain recently said in the trial that safety inspections of the vessel really didn't take place before the ship set sail, that practice was actually fairly commonplace. And when you look at Korea over the past 20 years, we see several different kinds of accidents that are all safety related. We can look back to the 1993 Sewol ferry disaster. We can take a look even at the 1995 Sungpoon department store collapse. And even recently, we have the huge sinkholes in Jamsil. So why is it that we still have this pattern of cutting corners and ignoring safety issues? It's something that goes beyond the Sewol ferry. What needs to happen to ensure that these things don't repeat in Korean life? Why are they happening now?
But, frankly speaking, I think, the wholesale change should take place to repeat, to, prevent this kind of, things from happening again. As you point out, even with, that bizarre history of, disaster, we are, still having the, the problem, having the tragedy like a Sewol, the Sewol, ferry sinking. And I think, there's, I think, 2 things can be, attributed as, the root causes for that. Number one is, our, Korea has developed it so fast that, in a way, people tend to cut corners and taking, the cutting corners for granted. And that's, I think, the causing the, this problem. And secondly, in connection, we have a mentality, pali-pali, the culture.
Right.
And that, I think, prepared us to achieve as much, the development as probably advanced countries would take, the 100 years. In the space of, 30 years, I think 30 or 40 years, we have achieved, same amount of, the development as advanced countries would take, the centuries. So I think, pali-pali munha, that is helpful so far. But side effects of pali-pali culture is, I think, are showing the ugly sides.
All right, one last question. Bottom line, do you think the protests, the hunger strikes, the continued public outrage, do you think that's enough to make a difference, or does something else need to happen?
I think, it's important. I mean, that I owe, the saying on, saying this on two accounts. Number one, I think it's, the grieving process should run its course. In other words, we cannot just, bring the grieving, the families and grieving nation and their, grieving process to, the southern halt. We need to let this, the emotional, the pent up situation run its course, and that's, very important. And secondly, I think, our country is a problem, I think. Our country is a problem is, one-dimensional. I will explain to you. That is, when we look at, our history, it's like, as I said before, it's a history of one disaster after another. In other words, the pace in which we are in, gripped by the one disaster, would only replaced by another, the advent of, another disaster. So that means that we are now seeing the phenomenon of that. In other words, we are preoccupied with the, Sewol disaster. We cannot afford to pay attention to other very, not equally, but very important, the state affairs that will, keep us, going. So we need to, I think it's, we are at the, development stage. We are not, we used to be, we have been one-dimensional state, but we are trying to be, the multi or, the double or multi-dimensional society in which the tragedy, the big tragedy can be dealt with, and at the same time we can, deal with the, other, the priority, the state affairs as well.
All right. Thank you very much for joining me. Youngjin Oh is the managing editor of the Korea Times, and I really do appreciate your time this week.
Thank you for having me.
For those of you listening to the podcast, I do have a question for you. Do you believe the protests will be enough, or will the government continue to do what it wants and ignore public opinion? Be sure to leave your thoughts and to stick around for the Asian News Update coming at the end of the program in just a few minutes. Hong Kong reverted to Chinese rule in 1997. And when China did take control of Hong Kong, the former British colony, they enabled the One Nation, Two Systems policy, an attempt to ensure Hong Kong's democratic foundation. This summer, a growing number of residents became concerned about their electoral future. They started voicing opposition to a proposed system, similar to the one that's currently in place, where Beijing selects candidates for Hong Kong leadership positions. Quote, "She seems comfortable about Hong Kong only when the current rule through the elite approach works," said Yu Mao-chun, an expert on Chinese politics at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Up to 10,000 Occupy Central protesters have been calling for universal suffrage, the right to freely nominate and elect their own officials beginning in 2017. Wang Zhenmin, a Chinese legal scholar and member of a committee overseeing Hong Kong's mini-constitution, had this to say about the new system. Quote, "Less perfect universal suffrage is better than no universal suffrage." Wang also said, "Leave some room for future growth." Despite heavy rain earlier this week, protesters gathered at a park next to government headquarters. Some were even waving banners with slogans like, "Chinese Communist Party, you lied to us." Janice Chu, a teacher, said, "We want to vote for our own leader and not have him chosen by some committee. What is the point of voting for people we don't get to choose in the first place?" Michael de Goyer, a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University and a veteran commenter on local politics, said, "Activists had been naive in thinking Beijing would let a dissident rise to power in China's richest city. The Pan-Democrats were out of their mind to insist on public nomination because it was clearly a terrifying prospect to the central government. What we've had is a severe failure on the part of the academics leading Occupy Central to understand the national context. A main criticism of the plan proposed by Beijing is that Beijing will be picking all the candidates. Essentially, a committee in Beijing will hand-select a few candidates, and those are who Hong Kong residents must choose among. The likelihood that pro-democracy candidates will be on the ballot? Pretty slim. The NPC decision leaves no room for us to fight for a genuinely democratic system, and we will begin our campaign for peaceful, non-violent struggle, said Joseph Chung of the Alliance for True Democracy, a coalition of groups advocating universal suffrage in Hong Kong. Chung continues, "We want to tell the world we haven't given up. We will continue to fight." Chinese officials have called for restraint, trying to curb protests, and they've even called these protests illegal. Li Fei, the country's Deputy Secretary General at the top legislature body, said Beijing will not be swayed by the protesters' actions. Proving that point, Hong Kong police arrested 19 demonstrators late Monday evening, citing illegal assembly and obstructing police outside the hotel where a senior Chinese official was staying. Protesters are vowing to continue to press for universal suffrage, but the question does remain: can true democracy in Hong Kong be achieved, or is it naive to believe in a true one country, two systems governance? Don't miss our other podcast, Asia Now. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week, the Milken Institute's Curtis S. Chin discusses why the BRICS Bank is important to Asia. You can find Asia Now on our site, iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. First up in the Asian news brief, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has reshuffled his cabinet. The Prime Minister set a goal of having 30 women in high-ranking positions by 2020, and in this current reshuffle, he has selected 5 women to hold key positions. The World Economic Forum has ranked Japan 105th in last year's Global Gender Gap Report. According to the report, 3.9% of women hold board-level positions in listed Japanese companies. It is unclear if the move by Prime Minister Abe will offend more traditional men in his party, who feel they should have been promoted along tenured lines. The Islamic State, also called ISIS or ISIL, is the bane of many nations' existence, and unfortunately, they have once more killed an American journalist. They are an incredibly well-funded organization, thanks to oil fields in Syria and Iraq. U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel says they're a sophisticated organization and well-funded as any group that he has ever seen. They are beyond just a terrorist group. They marry ideology and a sophistication of strategic and tactical military prowess. It's causing a huge problem for U.S. assets, and unfortunately President Barack Obama was chided when he said that he doesn't have a strategy yet for dealing with ISIS. But the U.S. isn't the only nation trying to formulate a plan against the Islamic State. After decades of fighting in the southern region of Mindanao and the Philippines, costing thousands of lives, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, signed a peace agreement in March that commits it and the Philippines government to share power in the area. The MILF portrayed its leadership as vital to stopping the savage ideology of the Islamic State infecting southern Muslim groups in the region. Quote, "The MILF condemns barbarism and savagery whether done by other groups including the ISIS or even by its own members," in an editorial posted last week. 2 other armed Filipino Muslim groups, the Abu Sayyaf and the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, or BIF, have unfortunately vowed allegiance to ISIS in video clips. Some politicians in the region have expressed concern that both groups may be sending recruits abroad to fight along the Islamic State, but the Philippine military said there has been no concrete proof that this is taking place. If you're unfamiliar with Abu Sayyaf, it's a loosely organized Al-Qaeda-linked group of several hundred militants blamed for the Philippines' deadliest terrorist attacks. The BIF, which numbers about 200 fighters, split off from the MILF after rejecting the peace talks and has promised to continue pursuing an independent Islamic State. The MILF also said, "For us, the threat is not the 2 groups joining the Islamic State. Their numbers are too tiny to be felt and to make a difference. The threat really comes from the extremism espoused by the Islamic State. Ideas are contagious and infectious, like a virus. And the problem isn't only in Mindanao. Monday of this week, 3 men were arrested trying to bomb Manila's Ninoy Aquino Airport and nearby SM Mall of Asia. Both of these attacks were thwarted. The 3 men have formed a group calling themselves the USAFFE. The reason for their attack? Well, it's what they perceive as the Philippines' soft stance on China. Switching to Malaysian Airlines, after a pair of disasters, the airline continues to be in trouble. A new 12-point plan has been unveiled to help reorganize and return the iconic carrier to profitability. In addition to delisting the airline, 6,000 jobs are being cut. Partly leading up to this was the disappearance of MH370, the biggest mystery in modern aviation history. Australia's Deputy Prime Minister Warren Tuss said the plane may have traveled even further south, and the search area is now moving there to look for the aircraft. He said that every effort is being made to solve this mystery. Quote, "The level of international cooperation that has been associated with this search has truly been outstanding. The passengers and families of MH370 have not left our thoughts, and we will do everything in our power to locate the aircraft and to help them find closure." CNN was granted access to the 3 Americans currently being detained by the DPRK. In the televised interviews, you can see the 3 men are in various states of distress, and that all of their answers appear to have been coached in some way or another. All 3 men, of course, were pleading for help from the United States to help speed their release. In short, North Korea wants to embarrass the United States and secure a high-level visit. It's unclear if the United States will agree to that, but if you're traveling to North Korea, you do take a risk of being detained while there. Probably the best option? Not to go. As I mentioned in the August 8th edition of Asia News Weekly, there was a huge gas explosion in Taiwan. Kaohsiung city officials were quick to blame LCY Chemical Corporation, and I noted at the time that that decision may have been presumptuous. Some politicians in the city are saying the mayor is at fault and have filed a lawsuit. KMT Council Caucus Whip Lu Shu-mei accused the opposition Democratic Progressive Party Mayor Chen Chu of dereliction of duty and failing to prevent the disaster within the 3-hour period prior to the explosions, when the suspected gas leaks were reported. And finally, let's end on a good note. A hospital in Xi'an has used 3D printing technology to reconstruct a man's skull. Mr. Hu is a farmer who fell last year from a 3-story house he was building onto a pile of logs. He was sent to the hospital and arrived in a coma. During that time, doctors removed a crushed part of his skull. The result was a depression on the left side of his head, and he unfortunately suffered from decreased vision and language skill impairment. Using a 3D printer, an accurate model was used to create a titanium replacement. The results of the surgery that took place on August 28th aren't known, but I do hope they turned out well. Those are all the stories for this week's show, but before I wrap things up, let's take a quick moment and hear what you had to say last time. First up is Super Goku Saiyan 1. You don't see really South Korean politicians in Korea saying positive things about the dictatorship, like Japanese elite politicians do. Even South Korean President Park Geun-hye has apologized for what her own father, dictator Park Chung-hee, did wrong, and the various human rights abuses and such. Now let me editorialize for just a moment. While it is true Park apologized for her father's behavior during her presidential campaign, many in South Korea would argue the words were fairly empty and didn't go far enough. In fact, when it comes to the nation's own history books, there are many items that are left out or glossed over. Moving on to another comment, South Korea is often held in high regard, especially by U.S. President Obama, for its high test scores. But there's also a huge problem with plagiarism. Kenny Dunlap posted on Facebook responding to a story that we shared, "The way Korea handles or doesn't this problem is interesting. It isn't new and starts when people are young. It's common through most levels of Korean society. I feel the hyper-competitive education system, coupled with Korea's ultra-Confucianism, are to blame for this. Before moving on, let me just say, it's always dangerous to label something originating out of culture. But having worked in the Korean education system for nearly 6 years, I will say that the practice of completing work, whether or not it is original, is far more important to many than actually doing the work themselves. The crime is not committing plagiarism. The crime is being caught. These, of course, are just some of the comments that you have left, and I gotta tell you, I really do value them, and I appreciate you for taking the time to leave your comments. Now, of course, you can always leave your comments on our webpage, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and if you want to, you can even record your audio response to us and email it to us. Now, to leave your comments, just find us on our website or go to Facebook. You can find us at facebook.com/Asian News Weekly, or you can tweet your answer to us at Asian News Weekly. If you would rather send that audio message, or if you have some questions or feedback, drop us a line. The email address is asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. Don't forget you can play and download all of our episodes on websites like the Korea Times, Japan Today, and Asia Pundits. But if you prefer the podcast form of the show, look for us on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Now, I have some very exciting news, and that is I am taking a little bit of a holiday. Beginning this weekend is the extended Chuseok holiday here in South Korea, or the fall harvest holiday in many Asian countries, especially in Chinese communities. It amounts to almost a full week of vacation for me, and I'm going to take it. So there won't be a podcast next week. Asian News Weekly will return in 2 weeks' time with a brand new digest, and if you're in the region, I hope you get some time off and can spend it with your friends and family and just make the time a little extra special. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your comments. For Asian News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asian News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.